in food deserts with little access to food beyond what one might find in a gas station. The film then winds through intimate portraits of 4 Native Americans reclaiming their ancestral food systems. We meet a chef, a forager, a young fisherman, and a young scientist. And we see their work about using food as a pathway back to physical, cultural, and spiritual healing. It's absolutely beautiful. If you haven't watched it already, the film is streaming on the GLF website through this Friday, and I really recommend it. This is Sanjay's second documentary about food systems, and he's also made documentaries about long-distance runners. He is one himself, as well as about weightlifting champion Sri Chinmoy, who has served as Sanjay's spiritual leader over time. So Sanjay, thank you so much for being with us today, and thank you for making this film. It was a really powerful reminder of what food can do when it's grown and prepared and eaten with respect and as it should be. So thank you so much for giving us this gift of a film. And before we get to that, I actually want to start with your childhood. And your father was a tomato breeder in Northern California. And he also worked with the International Institute of Tropical Agriculture in Nigeria. So you were around food and agriculture from a really young age. And what did he teach you? And how did your relationship with your father affect your relationship with food?
It's a great question and a great way to begin. You know, my father began his studies in his home country of India, in the state of Gujarat, and then began his graduate studies in the United States. And this was in the 60s at the height of the Green Revolution. And my dad was studying forage grasses under a professor named Jack Harlan, who was part of the whole American push for, in a sense, like spreading monocropping around the world. But my father's professor saw the need to protect genetic diversity. And my father's first job was with the International Institute of Tropical Agriculture in Ibadan, Nigeria. And he traveled to West Africa collecting seed samples of indigenous varieties, which he ultimately then brought back to the United States through a USDA seed bank in Colorado, where I was raised. And so his background was coming from India, where there have been traditional farming techniques practiced for thousands of years, written in a number of different religious and sociological texts, and with a deep cultural significance. When he came to the US, he also saw the books of people like Sir Albert Howard, who, you know, coined these brand new systems of organic farming, having spent decades in traditional peasant cultures like the farming areas of India, seeing how they farmed and coming and basically rebranding these traditional techniques as though they were coming out of a Western paradigm. So I'm sure my father saw both sides of the coin. The way that traditional ecological knowledge was being repackaged in Western systems, and at the same time, how those Western systems were being exported to replace or supplant traditional farming systems. And that sparked a real interest in my father in genetics, in the organic movement. And he ended up founding a seed company that primarily served the organic farming movement in California and Mexico at a time when these types of genetic techniques were definitely not the norm.
So it's really a mix of agriculture and also genetic science that formed your relationship with food.
And it's understanding that agriculture has a 10,000 plus year history. The difference, obviously, between how cultures around the world have and continue to practice agriculture and what we consider modern agriculture is that now agriculture is a supply chain based exercise where we have these retail outlets, which we call grocery stores, that magically produce all sorts of great foods that come from 5, 10,000, 15,000 kilometers away and involve a lot of logistical juggling. And that kind of unseen side of the agricultural system is really why most of us have been so separated from an understanding of what it's like working with the earth.
Mm-hmm. And I want to get back to that reconnection with the earth a bit later. But first, let's bring this back to the documentary Gather. And what made you choose to focus this documentary about Native Americans?
Well, the first documentary ever made actually was in 1929 by an Anglo-American filmmaker named Robert Flaherty. And he made a film called Nanook of the North about an Inuit community in Alaska. Now, the film has a lot of great things. Obviously, you know, it was the first documentary film, and Flaherty was kind of making up the rules as he went along. But it created an industry where those of us with some economic privilege, the ability to buy cameras, for example, and to live in societies where people could watch movies, began flying around the world to exotic places, meeting indigenous people, taking their stories, etc. Now, some of those movies were done with a lot of cultural sensitivity, some weren't, but I think it's inarguable that, I mean, the reality is now indigenous kids around the world tend to learn about indigenous issues through media created by non-indigenous people. And that has been very, very damaging. It's perpetuated colonial stereotypes. It's perpetuated a sense of deep inequity through the bias that non-natives bring to this realm. So that said, you know, myself as a non-indigenous person was incredibly wary about entering into this space, and I would never have done so were it not for a partnership with one of the United States' premier Native nonprofits called the First Nations Development Institute. Now, it's a misnomer to say there's any term like American Indian or Native American or Canadian First Nations people. Like in the United States, there are more than 570 federally recognized tribes with their own sovereign land, with their own backgrounds, and in many cases, their own languages. But more importantly, their own understandings of their local food systems and a deep sense of cultural and spiritual practice based on that traditional ecological knowledge. And so I would have never been able to make a movie like Gather, which focused on more than 3 tribal communities, without having partners that had 10, 15, 20-year track records with those communities. It would have been too much to spend the years I would have needed to build the trust.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think that's a really interesting point about, I mean, the film is about sovereignty back over food systems. And here you are talking about sovereignty over so many things, including their own media and how they're portrayed in public discourse, and so many narratives around Native Americans and Indigenous people all over the world. At the beginning of the film, you talk a bit about colonization and how it's used, or how it was used, as biological warfare for colonizers to conquer lands and their peoples. It's touched briefly upon in the film by one of the people that you profile, but could you speak more about this?
For sure. I mean, I think it's important, since we have an international audience, for everyone to understand a bit of the brief history of this modern wave of colonization. You know, it didn't just begin in the 1400s, but there was a series of doctrines really established from the times of the Crusades that set forth this sort of mercantile exploration of the world. I mean, it's important to note that governments in Europe weren't just looking to expand their own sovereignty per se. They were looking for economic benefit. And so, in a sense, the governments and the backers were like venture capital, and the quote explorers were like entrepreneurs, which is why English monarchies hired people like John Cabot from Italy, why the Portuguese and Spanish monarchies also hired Italian and other nationalities. It was much less about planting the seed of new countries as it was creating an economic engine. So in a sense, the explorers were effectively pirates. They were going to areas inhabited by other people, and they were trying to find ways to profit off those people. In some cases, like the French, to some degree, there were more partnerships. But with the Spanish and with Anglo-Europeans, it was much more about gaining access to land. The Spanish were looking for gold. Anglo-Europeans realized that the wealth that they could generate was based entirely on the land. It's important also to note that the majority of the world's economy before the Industrial Revolution was agriculturally based. And so when the English explorers and English government representatives came to the United States, what's now the United States, they were looking at the incredible fertility on the eastern seaboard. The US wasn't wild. It was a series of carefully interlinked biomes, ecosystems that ranged from farming to grazing to grasslands to traditional hunting and fishing grounds. And they saw the health of the soil and realized they could make a lot of money very quickly through monocropping cash crops like cotton, like tobacco, other things, corn, etc. And that fueled the rise of the United States. That also fueled the westward push from a colony that was literally on the eastern side of what's now the United States and pushed westward. It pushed westward not to capture land for public uses. It moved westward because new immigrants needed new economic opportunities. And economic opportunities in the US pre 1860 were almost entirely agriculturally based. And so they needed land. They needed land to monocrop as well and to grow corn, wheat, other commodity crops that they could sell to not only urban centers in the US, but could export back to urban centers in Europe. Native Americans occupied that land. And there is a deep and pernicious history of the displacement, forced displacement, treaty displacement of Native American people, of indigenous people, specifically to capture the value of their land and their access to waterways. Now, that created a playbook for the colonization of the rest of the world, for the colonization by Europe and North American powers of Africa, of Southeast Asia, of the Far East. We saw that same push for land and resources, the same idea of supplanting traditional systems with a strictly Western capitalistic viewpoint that negated the value of community participation in agriculture and community participation in food systems.
Mm-hmm. And why do you think this is so absent from common teachings of history, not only in the US, but in other countries as well?
That's a great question, and education isn't my expertise, but obviously there is a huge gap, and there's a complete disconnect between this now modern movement for regenerative agriculture, for permaculture, for more restorative practices, and the notion that peasant communities around the world continue to practice these techniques. Indigenous or subjugated people had practiced these techniques on these specific lands from time immemorial. I think the difficulty is understanding that the healthiness of the food system around the world has always depended on community, and it's depended on decoupling the idea of making profit off of calories. But that's the entire food system right now. It's like land is parceled into small plots owned by individuals or owned for making profit. Land is valued around the world for its economic potential. We're trying to maximize revenue per acre or per hectare. There's no real incentive for keeping land fallow. I mean, the incentives now come through carbon credits or other things that work in this sort of transactional economy. And so if we're to recognize the fact or the reality of this destruction of native food systems, we would have to reconcile with the fact that capitalism is almost the worst thing for creating a sustainable food system. It's not to say that transactions shouldn't happen. I mean, there has been a food economy since the time, human beings began to hunt. Food has always had a certain intrinsic value. But now it's become so kind of hyper inflated to the point where communities will sell products to places 5,000-10,000 miles away at the detriment of feeding their own people. For example, my first film was on Florida, the Florida tomato industry, on a group of farm workers called the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, who have now gained tremendous acclaim for transforming the way supply chains treat workers. Now, farm workers around the world often don't have access to healthy calories, even though they might be picking a wide variety of vegetables and fruits and produce. The people working the fields don't have access to the foods that they are literally growing and harvesting for other people. And this is the pernicious effect of what supply chain agriculture has done to the world. It's created a market where people who have money have no wants in the world. If you have money, you never starve, even if you live in a community or in a country that's experiencing famine. But those people that don't have that kind of economic equity can very easily fall prey to the transactional nature of the food supply chain.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things that this film talks about that I found so beautiful is the spiritual connection to food and the spiritual connection that your subjects have to food, using it as healing, using it as reconnecting with the earth, with each other, with building families, with building community. It's really beautiful. How do we harness that to counter the pitfalls that you're just talking about of capitalism and the commoditization of crops?
I think there's two aspects. There's an aspect if a person is indigenous, particularly if they're indigenous in a community in North America. Now, as people know who watch the movie, the food system was used as a flashpoint for subjugating Native American people. They were either displaced from their land, which is where their traditional food systems were based. They were moved to lands that didn't support those same types of food practices. They were forced to rely on US government rations. At the same time, children were forcibly separated from communities, forcing them to lose their language. When you lose your language, you lose all the names of all the foods. Now, when Native communities developed language specific to biomes and ecosystems, when you lose that language, you lose the ability to identify a lot of plants, animals, agricultural techniques, cycles, etc. And so reconnecting with those traditional foods is very much a reconnection with culture, with identity, not just on a physical level, but on a metaphysical level, because those cultural practices also contained creation stories. They contained songs, dances, spiritual practices that linked the practice of cultivating and stewarding land to the universe, to the creator, to other kind of cosmic entities. For those of us who aren't indigenous, I think it's important to understand that up until about 400 years ago, all of our ancestors pretty much remained confined to very defined locations, with the exception of some populations like the Ashkenazi Jews that had a multi-millennia history of persecution and forced displacement. Most of our ancestors built their genetic strength from specific food systems. Now, as human beings, we know now that if you go with a jacket or without a jacket, you can survive almost everywhere in the world, as long as there's clean water and there's fresh air. But if you are living, for example, north of the Arctic Circle and you're forced to hunt and fish for yourself, and you can't digest high amounts of fat, well, you will die most likely, and you won't be able to pass on your genetic content. So our genetic strength and our ability to survive and pass on these genes were very much developed by specific adaptations to food systems. Again, it's like we can adapt to almost any environment simply by putting on clothes, simply by using tools for shelter. But the real genetic adaptation comes from adaptation to foods, to plant medicines, to animals and other sources of caloric intake. So we've all been separated from that. We're all eating this supply chain, grocery-driven diet, which might be healthy for us. And if it is healthy, it's totally by accident. But we've lost the connection to ancestral grains, to ancestral techniques, whether they're fermentation or other sorts of scientific molecular techniques that were traditionally practiced. So if you go back into your own family history, ask your parents or your grandparents if they can remember what was in the pantries, in the kitchen of their ancestors, we'll get a more full sense of what foods made us who we are today. Now, there won't be the spiritual element because our identities don't necessarily tie in with those food systems. But I guarantee people that if they begin exploring that ancestral connection to food, their own sense of identity will deepen. And that process of self-discovery, I think, will spark some pretty incredible results.
That's really interesting. And that's something that we don't think about at all, is how the foods that came before us are making us, they've made our DNA. I think that's fascinating. What are some of the risks in bringing more attention to Indigenous foods and food traditions? And looking back at history, as we've talked about before, are there any potential harms in bringing more understanding or mainstreaming Indigenous food practices that you can foresee?
That's a great question. And we already see the harms. I mean, there's a lot of superfoods, for example, that come from Indigenous communities, like maca root, like ashwagandha, like other ginseng, for example. And there is a market around the world for those communities to sell those foods far away from the traditional communities where they're grown. And we see how economics transform those communities to the point where it's no longer profitable, or it's no longer culturally appropriate to farm anymore. And so it's this insidious cycle of the market finding a good, creating a cost for that good, and creating wealth in a community such that people no longer have to farm anymore. And then that traditional product literally disappears. That said, when it comes to Native American communities, there is a tendency to romanticize them, to want to go into those communities for secrets, for wisdom. It's a form of discrimination, really, to like prey on natives for their wisdom without understanding the very real pressures and the cultural needs of their own communities. So yes, part of the formula for Native American food resilience is staying out of the way and not treating their practices as part of the market. It's allowing those regional food economies, those local food economies, to grow without pressure from the outside world. A lot of it is policy based. In the US and in communities around the world, Indigenous people don't have the ability to steward the lands in the way they used to. They aren't at the table when decisions are made to dam rivers that would invariably destroy their way of life, but in their own worldview as well, would be completely detrimental to the societies that these dams purport to heal. So like in the United States, for example, in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, there was a gigantic push to create hydroelectric power, and by damming almost every single one of America's major rivers. It's now very, very clear that the economic ramifications of those dammings far, outstripped the quick and easy, energetic arguments for hydroelectric power. And a lot of those dams are being taken down, including the series of 4 dams on the Klamath River, where our characters, the ancestral guard from the movie, live. And so when it comes to helping Native groups, it's understanding that giving them a seat at the table, giving them access to their traditional lands will make their community stronger, make the rest of our community stronger, and that there's a whole series of practices that they need to rejuvenate without the pressures of the market.
Mm-hmm. So are there any Indigenous practices or any learnings that you learned from the process of making this film that you think should be adopted in larger scale food systems and the global food market?
Well, no matter where we live, whether we're in continental Europe, Africa, Asia, the Western Hemisphere, at some point, the people that lived on the land felt that they had an environmental responsibility. In this day and age, when so many of us aren't thinking about planting multi-generational roots in a place, we might want to live in a place to raise our family, but then we're thinking about moving someplace to retire or so on and so forth. Or we can't wait to get out of our hometown when we're 18 or 21 and never look back. We don't have the same responsibility to communities that our ancestors were forced to have. Like, we all knew that you wouldn't soil or desecrate your waterways because that's literally where you got your drinking water from. So everything from laundry to bathing was done in a pretty ecologically sound way. Now, when our water is coming from thousands of miles away, we could care less what the condition is of local lakes, local rivers, apart from using them just simply for beauty. So that said, it's like my takeaway is understanding that whether I live on land in the US, and I do, that Native communities used to live on, or whether I would live in France or Germany or Italy, most of us don't have the same commitment to our environment as our ancestors did. Number two, we don't have the same commitment to our food systems because food is so easy for us to get at a supermarket, a grocery store, a small farmer's market even. We don't know the names of our grocers. We don't know the names of our farmers. We don't know the names of restaurant owners, of food truck owners. If somebody disappears, moves away, has an economic hardship, we don't know that. But it's like developing these connections keeps our local food system strong. In the pandemic around the world, we all saw how the food system suffered by supply chain shocks. But we also know that we tended to rely much more on the smaller producers, on the local producers, than the big stores that were suffering the effects of massive supply chain disruptions. When things couldn't be shipped from thousands of miles away, those grocery store shelves were empty, whereas stores that had connections with local farmers and local food producers tended to have goods. And although we did have to pay more for those goods, we could count on those local supplies. So in terms of the larger question of food sovereignty, there is a way to start thinking about what food sovereignty would mean if you live in a non-Indigenous community. Effectively, can your local food community survive another supply chain shock? Can the people survive? Not just us as individuals trying to get calories, but is our food system equitable for all of the people that put in so much hard work so the rest of us can eat? Can we build in that community aspect? And whether we have to pay more to ensure that, can we develop a food system that will be here for generations?
Mm. I will ask you one more question before we go to questions from the audience. So if anyone listening has questions, please drop them in the chat box. But you have said in other interviews that you made Gather for Native Americans. You made it to inspire Native Americans to re-engage with their Indigenous food pathways. But it's also been really well received, and it's gotten some celebrities behind it. It was a New York Times critic pick. So why do you think it's resonating with a wider audience? But also, how are you seeing it resonate within the Native American audience that it was originally intended for?
Well, we made this film primarily for Indigenous audiences around the world. And we built it for them, which is why there's not a lot of context. Like Native Americans don't need the history of genocide. They don't need to learn about all the policies that have been set up and institutionalized, which hamper their ability to have access to land and reestablish their food systems. And so there is a lot of that context that you can say is missing or is already very well known amongst the communities that the movie was made for. But we were very surprised that there was any sort of receptivity from non-Native communities. I still don't really know why. I think that, with the more mainstream rise of movements like Black Lives Matter, people around the world are generally seeing the institutional legacies of colonial practices. The way that the criminal justice system tends to really only work for the benefit of one particular class of people. Economic education elite, in any country, whether you're talking about Botswana or whether you're talking about Great Britain. At the same time, I think the film really exposes how far away most of our lives are from that sort of deep bond with the earth. I mean, we all know that no matter where we are on this planet, our feet are on the earth. Our feet are on Mother Earth. We're breathing in the sky. But the characters in Gather exemplify a connection with those elements that's so much deeper than most of us. And I think we all long for those same types of experiences. We long to feel a sense of home no matter what environment we're in. We tend to only feel like our homes or our apartments or our homes or our backyards. We don't really feel the connection to the trees and to the parks around us. We don't feel that sense of ownership simply because those areas are so foreign to us. We can't identify those trees. We don't have relationships. We don't have a sense of gratitude to the trees that provide us, nuts, seeds, fruits, etc. Because that connection with nature is passive. We've in human history, we were always taught to interact with nature, that it was a give take. Like we would steward lands, we would look at the health of populations, but we also needed nature. We also needed to take. And our spiritual exchange was in the form of gratitude, it was in the form of consciousness, it was in the form of caring. But now, because we don't really have a need to steward the lands, to really take responsibility to work the lands, nature is like a museum for us. It's like a zoo. We pass through, but we don't touch anything. We don't take anything. And that's so fundamentally opposed to how we evolved as human beings that I think people see in the characters and gather what the rest of us are missing in our life.
You absolutely do. The way the fisherman knows how to use every part of the salmon and can say if the gills are red, then that means the fish is healthy. Or when the forager is cooking the rats that she killed with her own hands in the field, there's just such a hands-on and really intimate connection with their food sources that is really beautiful. And again, this film was just such a reminder of all of that. So thank you again. We have a question from our audience member, Melissa, and she's asking if you can talk a bit more about Elsie Dubray, who is one of the characters. She's the young scientist who wins her science fair by comparing the fat lipid contents of wild buffalo versus grain-fed beef, obviously finding the former to be much healthier. So Melissa is asking, why did she decide to pick this project? Were you with her at the time when she was designing her science fair project? And can you speak a bit more about why this was important to her?
Well, so as those who know from the film, the Lakota culture, the Native American cultures in the central plains of North America were intimately tied to buffalo. In fact, the Great Plains were the third largest carbon sink in the world up until the Industrial Revolution, when they were almost entirely monocropped for corn, and now it's an unmitigated environmental disaster. I mean, in the 1920s, there was a gigantic dust bowl in the Midwest in an area that just 100 years earlier had grasslands that stretched 2 meters tall and 3 or 4 meters root systems underground, that all evolved around the movement of buffalo. The Lakota people were so reliant on buffalo, and they had such a symbiotic relationship where they used the entire buffalo. The buffalo was part of ceremonies. The buffalo was part of their spiritual practice, that when the buffalo were destroyed, it ripped apart a lot of their identity. It's as though in Christianity, every single church would be burned, every Bible burned, every cross burned. You'd understand that over a period of 100 years, the connection to those practices would just be ephemeral. At the same time, looking at the genetic standpoint, Elsie's people had evolved with buffalo for so many hundreds, if not thousands of years. There was a deep, deep genetic strength built on access to buffalo fat, to buffalo proteins, to the tubers, to the other underground elements that really benefited from buffalo manure, from buffalo, migration, from trampling the ground, the seed spread, the pollinator, the bird spread, etc. That when that was supplanted with effectively a grocery store diet per se, Western products like cattle, monocropped corn, wheat, oil, sugar, that was so at odds with what built genetic strength. And in fact, we know that unchecked, that specific diet in almost every human being creates a series of very negative health outcomes: diabetes, hypertension, heart disease, etc. And so on Elsie's tribal land, on her reservation, she's seen the ills of the Western diet that's based on high content, high beef intake, high sugar intake, high carbohydrate intake. And so her thought was, can I develop scientific rationale for buffalo for everyone as opposed to cattle, not just for Lakota people, but she felt that if she proved it as a general hypothesis, then it would become policy wise allowable. Now, the reason why this is so important is because cattle is considered to be a farmed commodity in the US. And bison, because they tend to need a lot more land, they're considered wild, which puts them in a whole different category of harvestability, of meat policy, which means that you actually can't serve buffalo in schools on traditional tribal land in Elsie's reservation because it's not a United States Department of Agriculture appropriate, or approved food source. It's not considered safe for the general population. It's considered an exotic meat, let's say. And so Native people don't even have access, aren't even able to insert those types of crops into a food economy when they want to. And so Elsie felt that if she actually proved that buffalo is far superior for everybody health wise than corn raised cattle, she might be able to help change national policy, which then would affect local policy. And so it's not so much that she's studying it for a cultural reason, but she's studying it because her people are still under that sort of colonial yoke, that colonial kind of in that colonial prison of not being able to develop a food source, even economically within a free market system that their community had relied on for generations.
Mm-hmm. And to those who are listening who haven't watched, Elsie was in high school. She's very young and just had this really powerful message. To speak a bit about the work that the Global Landscapes Forum does, we work with the international science community, and there's a lot of talk about bringing traditional knowledge and Indigenous knowledge into science. But there's less talk, I would say, about bringing the science into the traditional knowledge and using the science to prove these traditional ways. And I thought that was really interesting and a really powerful message. We have another question from Becky asking if superfoods, which you mentioned earlier in the conversation, if they're the same as orphan or ancient crops, and if not, what are the differences between these?
That's frankly beyond my knowledge. But that said, it's like when you look at superfoods, maca root, spirulina, camu camu, cacao. There's a whole host of them. Goji berry. They tend to be crops that were not traditionally farmed as row crops. They were things that were foraged or harvested, quote, in the wild. Although some things, of course, like cacao and goji berry are now farmed in a traditional way. But those types of crops were really part of very, very localized food systems. And in many cases, they don't really support a larger commodification. For example, there are a lot of seaweeds that are considered superfoods. But in their kind of traditional sustainable environments, they can't be harvested in incredibly high yields. And it's also important to note that in many of those traditional environments, these superfoods actually underpin the entire ecosystem. Like if you grow corn in a field, it's like that corn is not being eaten by deer and birds and bears and other insects. That corn is literally just being grown for export from that land. But the seaweeds and these other superfoods grow in environments that have traditionally relied on them. And so to begin looking at them as a commodity, particularly because many of them are only growable in very hyper-specific biomes, you begin to change the environmental dynamics once you have to increase yields. Like you can't grow chlorella in the ocean, you have to grow it in fresh water. You can't grow spirulina in inland lakes, you have to grow them in a highly saline environment. Maca only really grows well at high altitudes, goji berry in specific environmental biodiversity zones. So they're not as well adapted to the global food system as corn, wheat, soy, rice, where there have been thousands of varieties bred, even pre-industrial revolution by people around the world. These superfoods tend to be one variety, one very specific species, and tend to require a very, very specific area of land. And the last part of that economically is that, once these micro ecosystems or these localized biomes began attracting these market forces, other lands for traditional crops that would actually be used to feed people are now converted to maca root or goji berry root or other types of ginseng. And while that brings in an economic windfall, very quickly once the market is built, people find other biomes around the world where these products might have adaptability without necessarily looking at the notion that they are truly invasive species in some places. But those communities, once the market passes them by, they've converted most of their land to these commodities, and they've got to begin the reintroduction of all of their traditional farming systems. In the meantime, since these things often take generations, people become much more reliant on Western supply chains, and they become much more reliant on little stores importing products into regions that traditionally were completely self-reliant. I mean, you see this more often than not in the cacao market, obviously the majority of which goes to chocolate, but those farming communities in Africa are growing something that was traditionally bred for use in Mexico, in Central America. And because of the nature of these cash crops, they've converted a lot of their arid land to these products, which don't really have any local caloric value. In fact, as you know from a lot of the movies that have been made around cacao, a lot of the people who grow the cacao, who might be working in tremendously devastating, unjust conditions, have never actually even tasted chocolate. So it's a nature of superfood versus commodification, and the genetic adaptability or lack thereof.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's your knowledge on this topic is so extensive, and thank you so much for sharing it all with us. I know we've kept you for quite some time, so we'll wrap this up. But if you learned one or two main messages in the process of making this film that you would like to share with the audience, what would those be?
That's a great question. We touched on it, but most of us really are not connected with the people in the food system. Like when your mom or your dad or your spouse creates a meal for you, there's an exchange of gratitude. You really feel that personal connection. If you go one step away and you're in a restaurant, unless you go to that restaurant every day, you don't necessarily have an emotional connection with the chef or want to even develop that. If you go one step away and go to a farmer's market, you're not necessarily asking about the workers who picked the food. You might meet the farmer. When you go one step even further away to the grocery store, you're not necessarily developing friendships with the grocers there, with the people at the checkout lines. But that's what we need for a 21st century food system. We've seen in the 20th century the effects of separating that human touch from the process of caloric intake, where everything is so incredibly sterile that we've lost any sense of what the last element is. Putting your hands in the water for food, putting your hands in earth for food. That spirit is still there, but it's in the people in the food chain. And so I would suggest, for people to gradually begin developing an understanding of the people in your local food system, understanding who they are and developing friendships. You don't need to do much more than that. You don't need to give them charity or patronize them, but It's just an understanding that it takes a lot of hard work, ours as well, earning the money to pay for all of this, but it takes a lot of hard work to put food on a table. And that by understanding those chains and the humans that really make those chains, we'll begin to develop what the next century's food system needs to be like.
That's such a beautiful message, especially around this time of year when so many people are gathering, although this year maybe virtually, around food and around tables. So thank you for sharing and ending on that note. Sanjay, it's such a pleasure to talk to you. We could go on forever.
It was such a fun conversation. Thank you.
And to everyone listening, if you haven't watched the film, again, it's streaming on our website through this Friday, and I can't recommend it enough. So thank you to everyone listening, and thank you to Sanjay, and we will see you next time on GLF Live.
Thank you once more, everyone.